1 Corinthians chapter 10. And some of you, many of you would not need to turn there. In verse 11, it says, all these things happened to them, referring to the Israelites, as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Or has come, so our ends of the ages have come. What occurred with and to Israel as they came out of Egypt has profound meaning. We've been through this many times, but also profound meaning and parallels to our life, our challenges, and our calling today. I want to connect what I have to say, obviously this afternoon, to Passover, which is now 8 weeks away from tomorrow evening. And it's not too early, as even was noted in the sermonette, it's not too early for us to begin thinking about Passover and what our lives are like right now and what our lives should be like, what changes we need to make. How we might reconsider some of our habits that need modifying, and looking forward to the Passover in that regard. So this afternoon, I'd like to review some of the early history of how Israel came out of Egypt and how it applies to us today. And so some of that history is easy to apply when we read various scriptures. We'll turn to some of those a little bit later. But above beyond the specifics, there are, I think, we can break it down to two broad principles, two ideas that we need to devote, or two lessons that we need to examine, and they're very important for us to do so. So let's turn to Exodus 23. Exodus chapter 23. And we'll begin reading in verse 22. And here we find God making some awesome promises, more than one, to the Israelites. In verse 22, it's recounted, but if you indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the Amorites and the Hittites, the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works. But you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. So eradicate all vestiges of their idolatry. So you shall serve the eternal your God, and he will bless your bread and your water. So he's going to give them all the sustenance they need. And I will take away sickness. I'll take sickness away from the midst of you. That, if we think about that, that's quite a promise. You know, what they had seen just happen to the Egyptians, and knowing they were humans, that they had their illnesses. But God says he will take away the sickness from them. No one shall suffer miscarriage or be barren in your land. That's an amazing promise. Here's what I'll do for you. And I will fulfill the number of your days. I'll give you long life. I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. That means they're going to flee from you. I'll send hornets before you, and they shall drive out the Hivite and the Canaanite and the Hittite from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. So he doesn't say it's going to be an overnight chore here. It'll be done in right progress, the right way. Verse 30, little by little I will drive them out from before you, until you have increased and you inherit the land. And I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the sea, Philistia, and from the desert to the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants out of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods, and they shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. And then in chapter 33, verses 1 through 3, a little more elaboration to the promise. Then the Eternal said to Moses, depart and go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it, and I will send my angel before you, and I will drive out then several ites. So, go up to a land flowing with milk and honey. Now he mentioned bread and water before. So now he's elaborating, he's saying, I'm going to give you plenty. I'm going to give you wonderful food. I will give you a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. Now that's interesting because there is a change here that where God was not, because of what they had done already, he was not going to be among them. Moses asked him to please go with them. Said, if you're not going to go with us, then let's let them go. And God relented in that regard. But we find that in that Numbers 9, if you turn over, records some of the progress, or the initial part of it. In Numbers chapter 9, in verse 1, and that the Eternal spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. So they're still, this is after they have been given the law, of course. In the first month of the second year, after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the children keep the Passover at an appointed time. So here, the second year, they've been out 1 year, they left at Passover time before. Now a year later, they're at Sinai, and the second Passover is observed, and also in the same chapter, the second Passover, which is when, if you can't keep the first one, the second, what we call the second Passover each year, is explained about how that is to be observed. Then in chapter 10 of Numbers, again going through the early history of the Exodus, verse 11. Now it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month, in the second year, that the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle of the testimony. So in that interim, the tabernacle has been built, and so the cloud goes up, and that's the signal for Israel to start the journey. And the children of Israel set out from the wilderness of Sinai on their journeys. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So they started out for the first time according to the command of the Eternal by the hand of Moses. So there, a year later, they start journeying to the promised land, and looking forward to the promises that God has given them. Of course, we are well aware that they did not trust God, not explicitly, in spite of their promises, their good intentions, that they would, in fact, serve and obey God. In Numbers 11, we have the account where the people start thinking about what they want, they start thinking about their stomach, and they'd like to have some meat. And so they crave meat and complain to Moses and to Aaron, and of course, indirectly then they're complaining to God. He responds, he hears them, he sends quail. He sends quite a bit of quail. You read the account, and it's at one point, obviously more than they could actually consume comfortably. And we go on then to Numbers 13. We have a momentous turning point, because it's one thing for them to complain, and God holds them accountable for that, but he doesn't take any drastic action per se. But in Numbers 13, of course, we find the account where they send the 12 spies into the promised land and to see what can be done to take the land. And Joshua and Caleb come back with good report, but the other 10 do not. They have a dreadful report, a threatening report, downright scary. And it sounds as if the whole nation of Israel basically terrified. And they refuse to go. And so God does hold them accountable at that point. Momentous turn of events, because God says, all right, rather than go into the promised land, we're going to turn back, and you're going to wander through the wilderness for the next 38 plus years. And that does not sound very good. So they decide they will go fight, which another bad decision, because God punishes them. He lets the Canaanites, he lets the Gentiles defeat them. And of course they end up turning back and they refuse to go. So a big turning of chances and opportunities for Israel. So let's fast forward all the way now to the 40th year. Over in Deuteronomy, chapter 9, and Moses here is speaking to them, and in the waning time he's with Israel. Verse 1 says, "Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today and go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than yourself, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim, whom you know and of whom you've heard it said, who can stand before the descendants of Anak? So therefore, understand today that the eternal your God is he who goes over before you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them and bring them down before you, so you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the eternal has said to you." Not quickly in terms of the whole area, but maybe quickly battle by battle. "Do not think in your heart after the eternal your God has cast them out before you, saying, because of my righteousness, the eternal has brought me in to possess this land. But it's because of the wickedness of these nations that the eternal is driving them out from before you. It's not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you go in to possess this land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, that the eternal your God drives them out from before you, that he may fulfill the word which the eternal swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So verses 4 and 5, it does explain to us why God was going to kill many of those people and why others would flee the territory if Israel were to follow the instructions that God would provide for them. In chapter 33, earlier, we won't turn there, but in chapter 33 of the book of Numbers, Moses has also talked to them about the fact that you have to go drive them out, you have to do this, but if you don't do that, you're going to be punished. There are going to be consequences for not following God in that regard. So they're going to go, we're going to cross the Jordan, and of course on that day that their account, Moses was allowed to look over the Jordan and look into the promised land, but he did not accompany them. And prior to that, his brother and sister had died earlier that 40th year. So let's turn over to the book of Joshua, chapter 3. And I won't read all of it, but the account given here in verses 1 through 17 is a significant account, because Moses had told them that God would drive them out. God would drive out the Gentiles, out of people of those other nations. And God is going to show them his power, and very, very similar to what this was now remember, this is now a different generation, because everyone all the adults that had lived at the Exodus had seen what happened at the Red Sea, but so had some of these individuals, even though the Israelites had been born during their journeys, but many of the Israelites at that point that could be, if they were 19 at the Exodus, then 40 years later, they'd be, I won't say old. That would make me feel real bad. But a good many of the adults had seen God happen, seen what happened, what God did at the Red Sea. But he's going to show them something very special. And in verse 10, Joshua said, "By this you shall know that the living God is among you, that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites," the new one added here, "and the Amorites and the Jebusites." So without fail, God will give you this land. He will drive out all the inhabitants. And he's explained why earlier. Because they are wicked people. And they're going to be killed or they're going to be driven out. And they've seen many miracles. They have witnessed for 40 years about having manna every single day. Now, after a while, that probably wasn't a big deal to them. It's always there, just so it's ho-hum. God gives us manna every day. But that really is a fantastic miracle. And they've seen many things happen, I'm sure, that's not even recorded in those years. And they'd seen the pillar of fire and the cloud go with them as they journeyed back and forth. And he says right here that God is among you. They had seen the evidence that God was journeying with them. Pick it up in verse 13. "And it shall come to pass as soon as the soles of the feet of the priest who bear the ark of the Eternal of all the earth shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that came down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap." It doesn't tell us how high they stood up, but one would think because at this time of year the Jordan flooded, and maybe that the commentaries point out that the people over in Jericho weren't too worried because they thought, well, they can't come across right now. The water's too high. There's too much water. But God took care of that. But it would imply then that there was a huge wall of water, at least if they're going from the eastern side of the river across. On their right side, there's a tall wall of water. And below them, the water is running away. And there is no water where they're going to be crossing. So verse 14, "So it was when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priest who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water. For the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest." So we know that's in the spring, that the waters which came down from upstream stood and rose in a heap very far away, even unto Adam, the city that is beside Zaretan. So the waters went down into the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, failed, so away from them, and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priest who bore the ark of the covenant of the Eternal stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And it's happening, it says dry ground. I thought, well, maybe damp ground or muddy, whatever. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I looked it up. It says dry ground. It means the desert is referred to as dry ground. So it's one thing to stop the water, but it's to dry up the dirt as well, if that's what happened. No slipping, sliding across the rocks and whatever. God takes them over across dry ground, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. And this is firm, dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. So a fantastic miracle again. One powerful demonstration that God is among them and will drive out the inhabitants of the land. And another reminder that the promise that God had made to Joshua, that God would be with him as he was with Moses. And Moses had been the one to lead them through the Red Sea, and Joshua now is the one to lead them across the Jordan River, reminding them again that Joshua is their leader. It's interesting, the commentaries, and they sort of agree, but the comment there is, going into the promised land, we have the account in the book of Joshua, obviously what they're doing in driving out the inhabitants, that it didn't happen overnight. As God said, it would not be done in 1 year. It'd be done gradually. And the estimates are anywhere from 17 to 27 years. I can't find enough evidence to show there's a specific time. I think if it was calculable, that smarter people than I would have figured that out, and it'd be in the commentary. But so they had an estimate of anywhere from 17 to 27 years. It took obviously a while for Joshua to lead them into the battles in which they would conquer the land. Back in Joshua 13, verses 1 and 2, Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Eternal said to him, "You're old and advanced in years, and there remains very much land yet to be possessed. This is the land that yet remains, all the territory of the Philistines and all of that of the Geshurites." Verses 6 and 7, "And all the inhabitants of the mountains from Lebanon as far as the brook of Misrephoth, and all of the Sidonians, them I will drive out from before the children of Israel." So it's still an ongoing work, getting rid of the inhabitants. "Only divide it by lot to Israel as an inheritance, as I have commanded you. And therefore divide this inheritance as an inheritance to the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh. With the other half tribe, the Reubenites, other half tribe, and the Reubenites and the Gadites received their inheritance, which is Moses had given them beyond the Jordan, eastward as Moses, that the servant of the Eternal had given them." So there was a separation, if you will, of the tribes of Israel, happened at that particular time. So he's promising to clear the land, and we know that Israel then, regardless of the admonitions that had been made, that they failed in driving out all of the inhabitants of the land. So back in chapter 23 of Joshua, verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass a long time after the Eternal had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua was old and advanced in age." So he's just setting the time there, but he's given them round about, he's taking care of them. But he's reading here verse 5, "And the Eternal your God will," and so he's right, Joshua's talking to them, "The Eternal your God will yet expel them from before you and drive them out of your sight. So you shall possess their land as the Eternal your God promised you. Therefore be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left. Unless you go among these nations, these remain among you. You shall not make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause anyone to swear by them. You shall not serve them, nor bow down to them." Where it says not make mention of them in any context of giving them some sort of recognition as God. You can't do that. And he says here in verse 8, "But you shall hold fast to the Eternal your God, as you have done to this day." In verse 11, "Therefore take careful heed to yourselves, that you love the Eternal your God, or else, if indeed you do not, or you do go back and cling to the remnant of these nations, these that remain among you, and make marriages with them, and go into them, and they to you, know for certain that the eternal your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps to you, and scourges on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the eternal your God has given you. So they're warned that they must complete the job. Otherwise, they're going in due time to end up losing everything. So in Judges chapter 2, we know that they have not done that. There are inhabitants in various places around the land that they had taken control of. The period of the Judges begins. Chapter 2 of the book of Judges basically is a summary of the entire book of Judges, the ups and downs that they were going to go through. And in chapter 3, verse 1, again the comment is made, now these are the nations which the Eternal left, that he might test Israel by them, that is, all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. So by virtue of the fact them not driving out all of them, all of the inhabitants, then God didn't back them up, and he left them there to test them. Verse 3, namely the 5 lords of the Philistines, and they come up quite often in the account, that future of the history of Israel. All the Canaanites, 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites, who dwelt in North Lebanon from Mount Baal, Hermon, or Ammon, to the entrance of Hamath. Then in verses 5 through 7, it lists some others. In verse 6, they took their daughters to be their wives, gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Eternal. They forgot the Eternal, their God, and served the Baals and Asherahs, serving the idols. So they succumbed to their temptations, the sins along the way, and mentioned elsewhere. Now, again, that's a little bit of a quick review of this early history of going into the Promised Land. And we can see the fact they forgot all, or ignored, or overlooked, or had no faith in all of the power that God had displayed to give them this. The history from Sinai, and for the next 39 years, the delayed entering the Promised Land, and then their failure to purge all of the Promised Land of the wicked nations that God had intended to destroy and drive them out. And then they would become a disobedient, or becoming an obedient and following the way of God to be a nation, an exemplary nation to other nations around them. And by the blessings that God would have given them, then it'd be demonstrating to the other nations the things that they did worked, and therefore would be rewarded. God knew Israel could not keep the spirit of the law. He expected them to keep the letter of the law, but they failed to do that as well, and to worship only him. And these things they refused to do. So we're looking at this, the whole idea of coming out of Egypt. We will leave that behind. Today we talk about coming out of the world. Now, in reality, of coming out of Egypt was what God wanted them to do. And in a sense, they were going to go into the world of the Promised Land. But to do so, they would be driving out all of the wrong influences. But rather than driving all of them out, they actually ended up being absorbed by it, by the other nations that were there. And so ancient Israel is pretty much, at that point, as with ancient Israel, our world today is a constantly and unrelenting test on us. By not driving them out, he says that those people would become a snare, and that's exactly what happened to Israel. We'll go down through all the history of what Israel did, but the judges, difficult time, eventually have a king, but by and large, up to the point where the northern house of Israel went into captivity, Israel or Judah and Benjamin for a time going into captivity, but even when they came back out, they never were the kind of nation that God wanted them to be. So God tells us, to bring parallels here to what happened in these 40 plus years. And so if we count about the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and then let's say 20 years of, because it's 17 to 27 approximately for driving out the inhabitants. So for 60, 65, 70 years is what we basically reviewed and set the course for Israel for the next millennia in time. So God tells us, though, in Revelation 18, chapter 4, that we are to come out of her, my people. Now, I know that verse, you can turn there, you'll put it in your notes, that as a very contextual application, talking about the very end of the age and Babylon and what's going on around us, and will be going on around us, hopefully in the not too distant future. But it's a general command given to all of God's people that we are to come out of the world, the broad application for that. And that idea of coming out of the world takes on an even richer and deeper meaning as we approach Passover. So how might we characterize our world? If we're going to come out of it, how would you describe our nation and societies, not only the United States, but elsewhere, and in particular, the descendants of Manasseh and Ephraim, modern-day descendants of the English-speaking world? How would we describe them? What are the pieces and the parts? What go with them? The standards, the laws, religions, and there are plenty of them, even in our nations, from which we are to flee. In coming out of the world, we're to come out of that part of it. Now, there's far more items than we can discuss in the time remaining for this. But I would like to take note of a few. Some of them, and one of them in a little more detail than the others, but hopefully touch on ones that touch us emotionally, where there is, God willing, a sense of righteous indignation of what is going on in our nation in particular and in the world in general. Things that should bother us, and ask ourselves, do they in fact bother us? Do they upset us? Do they sometimes depress us? Not that we want to walk around depressed, but we're sobered by it. Examining those things. And how would we characterize it? Let's turn over to Mark chapter 1. We'll read verses 1 through 4, and I think this gives us a valid description. Mark chapter 1, verse 1 says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, Prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. John came baptizing in the wilderness and preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins." Now, I think the word in the wilderness is literal, but I think it's also a metaphor that in terms of the truth of God, it was a wilderness. Even though they were the Jews, the chosen people of God physically, they didn't understand the truth and God's plan And beyond that, the world was lying in wilderness. And if that's the case then, how much more is that the case today? What we have around us is a virtual spiritual wilderness from which we are to flee and come out. What are those things that would characterize our society today? In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2, it tells us that Satan is the prince of the power of the air. He was from the time of Adam on, and he still is today. But if Satan was the prince of the power of the air, then for the last almost 6,000 years, I think with the advent of the internet, technology as it is, it's just staggering. And then you throw in AI, artificial intelligence, being described as the prince of the power of the air takes on a whole nother meaning. Because there is a mechanism in place that even goes beyond Satan being able to put thoughts into our minds. He's able to create an environment that people can see and hear and listen to that, in one phrase, the Bible talks about the depths of Satan becomes visible. Now, I realize that, again, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, it talks about Satan being the god of this world. Again, if that's true when Paul wrote the scripture, it's certainly true today, but maybe even more so than any other time, and being able to demonstrate these things. Now, I know with some of the nations, even at Corinth, that things were going on that people could see. They could be involved with things that were a problem, were great sins. But our world today is, if you will, it's scary. I don't mean that, I don't think it's hyperbole. That what is available to us through technology, we have the internet, we have computers, we have our phones. And if you think in terms of social media and the news, what was at one time, and not that many years ago, this was called the age of information. Isn't that term? But now it'd be more, I think, more appropriate to call this the age of disinformation. We talk about fake news. And again, with the advent of AI, I don't know, and few people really do know, where it's going to go. Even the people of the world, scientists and the creators of these things, warn of what AI might lead to. I'm not a big fan of some of the down to the word escapes me because I don't go see them. I did watch a few Star Wars movies, don't get me wrong, but some of the films now that I just don't follow them, so I can't know all of the power behind the theatrics that the filmmakers create. But even the ones that know how all this works wonder where this might lead that will hurt humanity. I mean, there are some people that have obviously not have some values, but in terms of the truth is just blinded, can be blinded by our technology of the day. Science, but technology will offer a little bit of if you look carefully, you can find presentations on evolution not being true. But you can find a lot more supporting evolution. Politics? Do we think the next election is going to be calm and peaceful? If anything, it'll be worse than what we had before. And again, that's scary. But if we think about medicine, good medicine, we've been through all the disinformation about vaccines, and it seems that a good number of people were helped, protected to a degree. But we also are now gradually uncovering continuing problems, and that a lot of things that we endured during the epidemic weren't necessary and were not good for us. This information age turned backward. In religion, we have a telecast on Sunday mornings and on Monday evening locally, preceded by and followed by sometimes I've listed, but maybe dozens of presentations on false religion, blinding the people, supporting all those things that are there. So what we have today, this technology, is a world from which we have to come out. Now, my phone, sometimes depressingly, at the end of the week tells me how many hours on average per day I was on the phone. Now, I realize I use that phone a lot for my work. Have no way of really keeping track of how much of it's work and how much of it isn't. But I do remember a time when I didn't have a phone that could chase me and follow me everywhere. There are a few of us here who remember the advent of car phones. And the people I worked for wanted me to have a car phone. And I said, no, it's my last bastion of privacy on earth, get in my car. And it's like, well, customers might need you. It might be urgent. I said, they've been running for decades without chasing me down on a car phone. But in the world today, in the job we have to do today, we need these phones. I understand that. We need our technology. We, in fact, use this technology. In order to preach the gospel, there's just too few of us. We need this to do the work. But it is in the midst of that little piece of that we're able to use to do the work, the world is surrounded by an enormous amount of misuse that Satan uses to great lengths in order to keep the world blinded to the truth. Again, whether it be social media, entertainment, you don't even need really TV these days. It's a TV screen, but you get on, you can watch the movies and you can watch any number of things, on your TV screen, but it's not really your TV per se, like it used to be. And you don't even need to. You can just go use the internet again and access all kinds of entertainment, and a lot of it good. Not to pat on myself on the back, don't get me wrong, but I cut the cable. And I've learned to like classical music a lot more because there's lots of it on there that you can just get off of the web, if you will, and listen to that in the background while you're doing something productive. But it's a dangerous, dangerous world. I put here in my notes, along with all of this deception, it is a quagmire of immorality, far more than we understand. But I'm not blinded to the fact, and none of us should be, that maybe we do have an idea of what's out there, unfortunately. But technology is, I think it's a vortex of Satan's influence, something that we do need to take very great effort and caution in using. Do it properly. Obviously, a lot is accomplished by it. But it's a world in general from which we have to flee and come out of that and not allow that technology to dominate what we're doing. Israel, in Egypt, we don't know what, it doesn't say they did these things, but when they came out of into the promised land, they now began to absorb the idolatry and participating in things that we have. Today, that would be pretty much you could compare technology and the internet and all that's out there to Balaam, finding a way to seduce us into doing things that God did not want Israel doing, and he certainly does not want us to do them. A couple other items. In general, Israel could be easily described as lukewarm. At best, they were lukewarm. At times they promised obedience, but lukewarm. If you go back, and I won't turn there, but go back, I would say, and read not only what I've read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses, I think, 5 and 6, and then verse 10, but read the intervening verses. That these were the things they were involved in. They had to be downright ignoring God in order to fall into those things. One of the things in coming out of the world we should be able to do is care about what's going on in the world and praying for God's kingdom. And so I have to ask myself, and I think all of us need to do as we approach Passover, how much do we sigh and cry at the abominations that are happening in Israel and the world? How deep are our emotions on seeing what mankind is doing to himself under the influence of Satan? Talk about violence. I pulled a report, I won't go through much of it, about war, about the violence. We've seen a great deal, a lot of in TV, what's going on in Gaza. And we've seen some of the clips, and they're heartbreaking to see what's going on. But that's what's front and center, along with war in Ukraine. I pulled a report in terms of just a special report from the Wall Street Journal on wars. There are 13, what they considered 13 major wars going on right now in the world. And I dare say any of us could name more than 2 to 3 of them, Israel and Ukraine, maybe 1 or 2 more. Won't read all of them. Right here, there are currently about a dozen major global conflicts that have risen to the level of mayhem and violence to make them regularly front page news. Conflicts going on for decades, and oldest being the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as we know, goes all the way back to 1948. One major conflict in the civil war in South Sudan ended in a deal of peace struck in 2020 after hundreds of thousands of people died and millions were displaced. Those numbers pale what's going on in Gaza into insignificance. Hundreds of thousands of people dying, millions displaced. 13 of them, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We know about that. For the Somali Civil War, been going on since January 1991. 23 and 9, 32 years of a civil war going on. It says a drought, it made matters even worse. The conflict had killed 25,000 people and again displaced millions. They have to move from place to place. And we read about our brethren in Myanmar. We realize it brings it down, brings it home. But in cases, millions have been forced to flee one area or another. One called the Boko Haram insurgency that involves multiple nations by this one group of terrorists fighting for that. The Syrian civil war been going on. But really big news. Still part of what's going on in the Middle East right now. The war has killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians and created 12 million outbound refugees and internally displaced people. You know, there were millions of the Syrians going into Europe. And these numbers remind us that the world is a dangerous place. And whether we sigh and cry about what's going on in other nations, along with what's going on in modern-day Israel, ask ourselves, you know, how deeply do we feel about the terrors that are going on in the world? And you throw in, even in the world, but especially our country, abortions, the hideous thing that has come to place. I looked up some numbers. Actually, abortions peaked in 1990. 1,429,000 abortions in 1 year. I didn't do the math, but if you divide that by 365, it'd be a pretty big number every day. 2021, last one I could find, 626,000. And the estimates are upwards of between 50 and 60 million total since Roe versus Wade was implemented in 1973. Politics, we get emotionally involved in politics. Do we sometimes forget we're apolitical? We're not involved in the world's politics. We are citizens. The scripture says our citizenship is in heaven. And that we are ambassadors for Christ. Do you know why we are away from the world and why we don't want our brethren in Myanmar to be drafted or pulled into the war, or because they won't do that, to be killed? And as I even mentioned in my note, but Mr. Weston points out in his video, it's a sample of what awaits us in due time as we reach further into the end of the age. But in terms of politics, again, all of the lying, the deceit, the greed, the selfishness, the striving for power, might we allow that to undermine our understanding of government in general? Because human nature doesn't like to be told what to do. Do we let human nature of the world, resistance and the anarchical attitude of resisting all government creep into our thoughts at all? Or do we appreciate the government that God has given us and the promise to actually be in his kingdom, implying a government that you and I should urgently desire to be a part of implementing and setting up? We should honor that government and appreciate greatly what God has done for us. So those are just some of the things that we want to avoid letting the world bring us to mind on these things. The other item, because I mentioned two great principles. One is just simply coming out of the world. That's the first one, and what that might involve. And the list can be long, but the other one is simply what Israel failed to do. They failed to become the exemplary nation that God could use to demonstrate to the rest of the world that his way worked. And you and I are called to a duty to show, and what we prove is one of the proofs of God's truth, that this is the church, that this way works, that we by doing God's way and God's law, following his service, and changing and growing and repenting of our sins and trying to make steady improvement in our lives, in our prayer and our study and the other things that go in to construct the mind and the character of God, God giving us his Spirit, that we are called to do a work. Israel had a work to do, if you will, being the exemplary nation, and they failed. And we can't afford to fail. We can't. Israel looked back, and why do they go back all the way to captivity? Now, it talks about going back. They weren't starving. They weren't there. But you go back and read what's referred to in most places. What was their menu? The leeks and the other thing. I'm not sure that if that was their steady diet, I don't know that I want to go back to it. Just go back to captivity. Go back to physical abuse, because at least they had food and they had water. But we can't afford to look back. If we look back, God says he's not pleased. He wants us to only look forward to doing the work, qualifying for his kingdom, and being a part of it as soon as he deems it appropriate to bring to us. And so we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, or your kingdom come, your will be done on earth. The sooner the better, because what's going to happen is inevitable. As terrible as those times will be, they are inevitable. Why not get them over with and get on in the kingdom? Do the work. Mr. Ruddleson gave a great summary of our duties last week in the sermonette. The many facets that we undertake, some of which seem to have a little bit minuscule effect. We don't know how much. But God has inspired these elements to be in his work. And we don't know behind the scenes how God is going to use any one of those things. And if at some point it's deemed that that's not the thing we should be doing, Mr. Weston comes to that conclusion, we'll pull that out and we'll do something else that God inspires. But we are called to do a work. Over in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. Hearkening back even to the first point. But in order for us to do the work of God, it says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So we want to come out of the world and devote our energies, devote our mind power, devote our physical power, devote our resources in serving one another, being a part of the body of Christ, but as the body of Christ, do the work to which we've been called. Revelation chapter 2. A general statement, I understand, but it has the right word part of it, for what I'm saying. Verse 26, Revelation 2, verse 26. And he who overcomes out of the world and keeps my works, and I think the work, as we call it, is a part of that. And keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. God does hold us accountable. We talk about the Ezekiel Commission, Ezekiel 33. He does hold us accountable for what we've been called to do. It's not like we have a choice. We have a work to do, and we have to own up to that. And we do. Mr. Weston writes the co-worker letters and you read his words of gratitude going out to all the co-workers, you know, we have more members than we have co-workers. Those letters of gratitude are for you and me, reminding us that what we're doing and the merit behind it, how important it is. Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. We turn to them so often, and maybe once in a while they lose luster. I don't know. I hope not. Because some of the final words of Christ, verses 18 in chapter 28, and Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always. That's the kind of promise that He gave Israel. He said, I am among you, and I will drive them out. And they didn't believe it. But God tells us that He is with us always, even to the end of the age. He will give us, through His Spirit and through His intervention, the power and the strength, the will to do and finish this work. So in closing, maybe we can assess how far we've come in the last year since Passover. I asked someone the other day about just a generic question, but what was it Mr. Weston said to us at Passover time last year? Now, I know that's, again, have a couple of sermons, so pick a phrase, whatever. But the one that's stuck with me all these months is pick a big one. Now, what he was talking about was to choose a difficult item to overcome. Work on it. Because we it's like getting a lot of to-do tasks. You know, we pick the easy ones first, thinking somehow the difficult ones are going to get easier. They don't. And all the performance people say, do the tough things first and save the easy ones for last, because then it's downhill from there. But pick a big one. And hopefully we did. We can ask ourselves, how far have we come? And it's been about 10 months. How much progress have we made? Now, my guess, if it was a difficult one, it probably is still there to some degree. Otherwise, we would have maybe changed those things years ago. But we can assess, where are we today? It's what he said. The question was, where will you be this time next year? Well, where are we this time next year? Asking ourselves as we assess, and it's not too early to think about these things, where we are, how we're doing, how much have we come out of the world? How do these things, how much do they matter to us? God says we are to come out of the world and to do a work. So, let's take a very spiritually objective inventory over the next few weeks as Passover approaches, and ask God to give us our insight to see ourselves as He sees us, and have this inventory, and when the time comes, pick another big one.